This is a quote from a Army company commander in Vietnam to Peter Drucker, who is a management consultant, basically. It says, "Around here, I'm only the guy who's responsible. If these men," referring to his men, "don't know what to do when they run into an enemy in the jungle, I'm too far away to tell them. My job is to make sure they know. What they do depends on the situation, which only they can judge." I think that's really telling for a lot of the medical director role in EMS, honestly. I can't tell you what to do most of the time. I am ultimately responsible for what you do if you work in one of the services for which I'm medical director. But I can't really tell you because I'm not in that situation. And I think a lot of times there would be a lot of folks that would say, well, I would do this differently, or why did you do this, et cetera, when you're not in the situation. And one of the hardest things about doing this, especially when you're first getting started, is trusting that folks are basically going to have to do what they think is best in the meantime, like in that moment. Now, if there's a systemic problem with it, like we haven't told you how to take care of an LVAD and you get handed an LVAD patient, then okay, that I understand that. Or if there's a specific knowledge problem because you were hungover that day in paramedic school, all right, we can fix that. But for the most part, a lot of these are judgment calls, and building the judgment can be a really difficult thing. So we try to give you all the information, all the knowledge, and all the skills that we can within the limits of what we can do, and then we trust you to go out and do it. And again, this is me speaking for medical directors. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes because I'm not going to be there. So whatever you do, I basically have to back you up on it, because if you did something wrong and it's because we didn't tell you about it, well, that's our fault too. But even if it's a judgment call, maybe it just takes a little more time to do judgment. Most of these are going to be system errors to start with. What's this have to do with anything? Well, I think it has a lot to do with this subject, the airway in the field. It is by far, intubation is probably the most dangerous thing that any of us do from an emergency standpoint, probably in, anesthesia. Most of that stuff, this is about the most dangerous thing that we're going to do to somebody, and has the highest rate of people that just die as a result of it, that we do relatively frequently and with relative aplomb when we do it. And we have to be careful with it. That said, folks are so worried about the airway sometimes that I think we make bad decisions. And not just folks in the field actually managing the airway, but folks who are trying to give you the information or setting protocols or directing you in terms of what you can do in the field regarding airways. And I think we shoot ourselves in the foot a lot of times, because we make it harder on our paramedics and our critical care transport nurses and everybody else that has to manage a field airway by not only recognizing the situation that they're in, but by taking away the tools that may be helpful for them. So I put this up here, much like landing on a carrier, you've got to line this up right. But in the setting of you're actually out there doing it, all the training, all the commander lingo that's come on, and everything that somebody tells you to do really doesn't make a big difference, because it's up to you to put the plane on the deck. And that's sort of the same way in our field airway stuff here. That was a roundabout way of saying we got to trust you, and hopefully most of us do. But anyway, let's get on with a little bit of a proof here. Let's talk about my vision of the airway and what I think you should be doing out in the field. And again, if you work for me, then you can take this to say this is probably where we're going to go. Don't go outside of your standard protocol that you are working on right now. And if you don't work for a service that I'm medical director for or have something to do with, then take this as, this seems like a good idea. Maybe we should talk to somebody about it before we actually try to implement it, because these are ideas. I am not selling it as everybody needs to be doing it this way or operationalizing it this way right now. Okay. Given that's everybody at some point is going to need somebody with emergency airway management. If you are a field provider, you are going to see somebody that needs emergency airway management. It's just going to happen, and that's the nature of the job. Now, that said, we don't really have a better tool than endotracheal intubation right now for definitive control of the airway. Maybe equivalent if you look at the new generation supraglottics, but not a better tool than endotracheal intubation. And it is still considered, in my opinion, the gold standard for airway management in the end. What is a definitive airway? Ask anybody that and they will say an ET tube. That's debatable a little bit, but that's what people are going to say. Now, given the best chance of getting an ET tube in somebody is doing it with sedation and paralysis, and given that there is nobody that is a higher medical authority in the field, generally speaking, than the paramedic or the critical care paramedic or the critical care transport nurse, that is the highest level of medical care that is available in the field. I say because that is, we are not calling for somebody else. This is the end of it. This is the cavalry that has arrived. We should give the cavalry the best tools to be able to get the airway in place, at least as best as we can. And I say, therefore, all transport teams, appropriately trained transport teams, whether 911 ambulance or critical care transport or whatever it is, should be able to RSI. Not only should have the ability to do it, meaning like, okay, your regulatory compliance with your protocol, it lets you do it, but that you should have the training and the skills to be able to do it as well. Folks may read that and say, well, wait a minute. If we give paralytics, if we RSI somebody, there's a problem. And that is that the patient's going to stop breathing when we give them those paralytics. Folks think of RSI as something like this. Like we're standing on the edge of a cliff. As long as they're not paralyzed, we're okay. As soon as they're paralyzed, you're free falling and hopefully somebody catches you. That's not really the case in emergency area management. Maybe anesthesia where you can kind of walk back on the cliff and it's okay to hang out on the edge. But in emergency medicine and in EMS, it's got the word emergency in the title. And we don't really have a choice, theoretically. Like, if we had another option other than intubating the person or other than, controlling their airway entirely, then we probably would have done that. But if we think that that is the option, there is some reason that we're being pushed that direction, there's really not a back up a little bit and we can just kind of, cancel case and walk away. We gotta be able to do it because there's some reason that we started down that path in the first place. So it's not so much, I think, of let's step off the cliff and hope that things work out okay. What we need to be able to do is give people a ladder, an exit route, a safe route, albeit somewhat precarious, to get off the edge of the cliff. And yes, you probably shouldn't just jump into the air, paralyze somebody with all, with gusto, and expect this is going to work out great all the time, because I'll show you why it won't in a minute. But we need to give people that means to escape, and that probably means sedation and paralysis for most people's airway in the field. All right, if we get paralyzed, the person stops breathing, yes, true, but we also get them intubated better. There's another problem, too, when you start talking about allowing paramedics and transport teams to intubate in the field at a wide scale. And that is that paramedics have got kind of a bad rap on terms of their intubating skills. And maybe we shouldn't say that, but pre-hospital airway success rates are not that great. And that's probably a fact. Now, it's not necessarily that paramedics, I'm just going to say paramedics from here on out are terrible intubators. It means that there's probably systemic stuff that we haven't done that has made our pre-hospital airway attempt success rate to be so low. So there's a couple of studies that people will look at. This top one is comparing paramedics on the top line versus HEMS nurses versus HEMS physicians and first attempt success rate on intubating. And you notice that physicians are 84.5% likely, 84.5% first pass success rate. Paramedics were a somewhat dismal, less than 50%, 46% success rate on their first attempt. So less than a flip of a coin likely to get the tube in on the first shot, which sounds bad to people, obviously. Unfortunately, this is not just one study. If you look at the PART trial, which was cardiac arrest with ET tubes versus supraglottic airways, iGels, and you found that the paramedic success rate, again, for intubation on the first shot was just about 50%, 56% successful in this case. So when you have people looking at that and saying, wait a minute, plus we've got all these folks that get unrecognized esophageal intubations. This was a story, Rhode Island is I think where it was? Yeah. Where they commented on the never event of unrecognized esophageal intubation, which I've talked about before, and I absolutely agree is a terrible thing. But realistically, when you have all this out there, all this data, what is taken to be this is a real thing. This is the thing we look for, data that says paramedics are not good at intubating. Why in the world would we say you should intubate more or we should give you paralytics to use when you're intubating? And let's look at the reasons first, though, why it's so hard to intubate in the field. Number one, we have preparation, and preparation not of the patient for this intubation attempt, but of the paramedic or the transport nurse or whoever it is to start with. How many times have you actually intubated somebody? When you leave paramedic school, basically you maybe have done a live intubation. Maybe if you got lucky in the OR, you've gotten a couple. But for the most part, we don't really require you to have actually intubated live people very much. And that's a national standard. That's not just one paramedic program. It's just not there. You say, well, we do the rest on a simulator. That's not the same. Our preparation is not there. And we don't really give people a good footing to kind of stand off of. We know the basic mechanics of it, but the technique, the actual doing of the thing, is lacking. How about the patient themselves? These are not particularly healthy patients. Otherwise, they wouldn't need advanced airway management in the field, in an emergency, by EMS or by emergency medicine. The patients are harder to start off with. The positioning of the patient is often bad, like this kid stuck in a car seat, or maybe they're hanging upside down for some reason, or maybe it's just grandma wedged in between her bed and her pile of like magazines that you can't get in there and do much with, and we can't lift her up for some reason because she's 450 pounds, and we're having to do this backwards on the floor. Patient positioning is a bit of an issue. That thing that you always try to make better is an issue. How about the parts themselves, the equipment that we have? How many people have intubated with a video scope recently? I will tell you that is becoming and will be the standard, I'm sure. Everybody has said that for the last 5 years, but I predict within about 5 years, as it becomes more standard equipment and the cost comes down a little bit, that we will be saying everybody should be intubating via video. How many of you have intubated via video before? How many of you have a bougie easily accessible on every ambulance? How many of you have a full complement of ET tubes and all the equipment that you might need to do it? Most of us don't. Most of us have just got a little airway roll with some tubes and maybe a stylet and some Mac blades. Or maybe our equipment isn't where we really need it to be to manage all these airways. How about the preconditioning of the patient, preparation for it? It's very unlikely that you've been able to adequately apneic oxygenate this person, or not apneic oxygenate, pre-oxygenate this person before you try to intubate them. Likewise, they're probably not fasted. They may have just eaten Hardee's 5 minutes before you showed up to their cardiac arrest or to their CHF exacerbation. And those French fries may be all in the mouth. The preconditioning of the patient is hard. How about our protocols? We intentionally limit the use of paralytics and sedation in a lot of people, and so you're trying to fight in a tube in a patient that really does not want that tube in their throat, and so we sort of kick ourselves in the butt by making it harder on us just via our protocols. How about paralytics? Again, most of the time you can't give it. It makes intubation easier and decreases the rate of gastric reflux and aspiration, but yet we don't let people use it because we're worried that then they're not going to be able to breathe, and then you can't back out. You don't have a back out plan to go with it. You just have to go at that point. And then again, practice itself. Not only does the paramedic probably not have a great foundation for intubation, but how many times have you actually intubated? When you look at most paramedics are going to get probably an intubation a year. If you work at a service with any kind of decent volume, you probably get 1 to 1.5 intubations per year. When I looked at one of my services, we compared in the last 365 days, the highest number of intubation attempts was by one person who had 5. One of them was successful, 2 were failed intubation attempts on the same patient, and then there were 2 other ones. The next person had 3, and everybody else has had either 1 or 2. So you get one shot at this on a live patient in 365 days, and most of us are not routinely practicing intubation. Even if you have a good education program, you are probably not actually intubating someone in the proper setting, other than just like, yep, stuck tube in, it was fine. We are not really practicing it. And so, of course, our outcomes are not going to be that great. Folks talk a lot about, why hospitals should fly, why healthcare should be like the airline industry, and there's some good things out of it, the CRM stuff and maybe some ideas that we can take. But realistically, the big difference between commercial airlines and us, I kind of said this before in a different way, is that if you're sitting on the end of the runway and you see this ahead of you, that airliner can just turn around. Or we can just sit on the tarmac and say, we're going to let this blow over. We are not taking off in this stuff. For us in the emergency setting and in EMS, we take off into this stuff because that's the job. but we sort of treat it as if we could just turn around and say, well, nope, that patient didn't actually need to be intubated to start with. We don't have the option of turning around. We have to proceed. That's why we're in this situation to start with. So everybody ought to be able to get aggressive, safe, missed a G there, comprehensive airway management in all cases. If an ambulance comes to your house, that person ought to be able to manage your airway. If it's EMTs, basic airway management, which is some of the stuff I'll talk about in a second. If it's paramedics, you ought to be able to fully and aggressively manage this person's airway to make them not hypoxic, fix their ventilations. How do we do that? Well, I think everybody should be able to RSI. Everybody should be able to give sedation and paralytics to aid in your intubation attempt. Now, that's cool. Great, lovers. How much like we might ask other people, how much is it going to cost? What do we have to do that? Well, realistically, probably everybody needs to get like 50 tubes to start off with, preferably on a live patient, and they need to get at least 10 tubes a year after that, again, preferably on a live patient, but we could do it in high fidelity simulation, maybe in the right setting. And so how much would that cost? Well, for an 80 paramedic service, which runs, 8,000 runs a year, something like that. That would probably cost us about $3.5 million and take 3 years practically to get everybody in and get those basic requirements done. At which point we have to recycle and do everybody again. Oh, well, that's we can't do that. Okay, what's our next option? What if we change the paradigm and say, let's not go so much for the RSI. Let's go for the rapid sequence intubation. Let's go for the rapid sequence airway. And you may have heard this before, and I do not take credit for this. Darren Brody was the first one he's the guy on the right, who actually put this out as the initial thing, who first published the term rapid sequence airway, where a flight team basically gave sedatives and paralytics and then decided to just place a supraglottic airway rather than intubate. And then I give the second half of the credit for the stuff I'm going to talk about to Jeff Jarvis, who gave a presentation and does a talk from which I stole a lot of these ideas. It's a different talk. I'm not plagiarizing, but he's got in his service where a lot of this stuff kind of came from, and then was able to publish on it and show that it actually made a big difference. So here's the tenets of airway management for us, and why I think that everybody could safely use paralytics and sedatives in the field. Now, outside of the basic, there's going to be some people that are just, don't take this the wrong way, just dumbasses and are going to screw this up at some point. They would do that anyway. Let's take the regular cadre of folks who are out there that we believe to be prudent paramedics. What do we tell them to do? You can break it down into this way. We got to resuscitate our patients before we intubate them. We can't start intubating them if they're hypoxic. We make our first shot the best shot when we're intubating, and we don't let them become hypoxic whilst we're intubating. And then we resuscitate them again afterwards. And you probably have heard, maybe you've heard of the -1A metric at the bottom. How do you know that your intubation was successful? Well, did the tube get in the right spot? Yeah, but if he got hypoxic down to 10% in the meantime and arrested for 5 minutes while you were doing your intubation attempt, then yes, you got the tube in the right spot, but you killed the patient doing it. So -1A, definitive airway sans hypoxia and hypotension on the first attempt. That's the gold standard metric, and appropriately so, for field airway management, I think, and management pretty much any place else. Definitive airway without hypoxia and hypotension on the first attempt. That's how you know that you were super successful in your airway. Now, you can still be successful and not meet that metric, but we'll talk about that in a little bit.